Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I hope you're all doing well. Now we are waiting for Alan to join our webinar and we will start. I hope the course we are running regarding TKT is useful because we are getting dear colleagues very positive feedbacks regarding this. So if you have any further questions and comments, you're more than welcome to contact administrators. Alan, if your name is iTEFL Webinars, can you please write in chat box? Okay, now I would like to welcome Mr. Alan Pulvernet, who will make a presentation about TKT. This is the fourth course of ours. Alan?
Thank you, Mohammed Khan. I'm sorry about the delay. I actually logged on about 15 minutes ago, but was waiting to be admitted. And
No worries, it's okay. Just because the private webinar, that it was due to the name, but that's perfectly fine. Okay, I would like to give stage to Alan Pulvernet. Please go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, I've tried to change my name. I think I might have succeeded, actually. Let's see. No, well, yes, it has got my name at the bottom, but it still says iTEFL Webinars. I did a webinar for iTEFL a couple of weeks ago, and I just haven't been able to get rid of that nameplate. Anyway, let's get started.
Hey, sure, no worries. Go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Glad to be here again. This, as Mohammed Khan said, this is the fourth in our series of TKT webinars. And this morning, of course, we're going to be focusing on receptive skills, on reading and listening. Excuse me. Just before we start, a quick word about your homework last week. I've only received homework from 2 members of the group. So I don't know if everyone's been very, very busy or if you found it too difficult and gave up. I'm sure you didn't. But this is just to say I'll still be very happy to receive your homework task if you'd like to send it to me. There will, of course, be a further task this week, though you will have longer to complete it, because next week Chris is with you, so you'll have 2 weeks to work on this week's task, which I'll send you after our meeting. Okay, let's get started. Here we are. So in this session, we're going to touch on a number of topics, looking at the distinction between receptive and passive. You might sometimes look at students reading and listening and not see anything happening, but of course, something is happening inside their heads. So we want to emphasize the idea of well, this might sound rather contradictory, but active reception and passive reception. We'll think about the differences between reading and listening in real life and in the classroom. And also think about what happens in the classroom in reading or listening lessons. Are we teaching, or are we just checking comprehension? Are we just testing rather than teaching? We'll think about similarities and differences between reading and listening. They're often yoked together, and clearly there are a lot of similarities, but there are also some key differences, which as teachers we need to be aware of. And then we'll summarize some principles about teaching receptive skills and look at some of the practice. So first of all, receptive or passive? Both reading and listening are invisible, but as I suggested just a moment ago, they are actually highly active processes. There's a lot going on. There's a lot happening. So, a task. What are you doing when you're reading? What is the nature of this mental processing that goes on when you're reading? Could you put your ideas in the chat box? Sorry. There we are. So what's happening when you're reading? What's going on in the reader's mind? Think of yourself when you're reading. When you're reading in Uzbek, when you're reading in English, what's the nature of your mental processing? What are the mental operations that are enabling you to understand the words on the page? Analyzing. Yes. Perceiving. Yeah, I think those are actually two very good key words, because as we'll see, both when we're reading and listening, there's a balance, a combination of analytical and perceptive processes. Comprehending the reading, pronounce thinking. Not quite sure what that means. Thinking, certainly, not sure about pronounce. Someone else saying analyzing. That's very interesting because we've got perception and analysis, and perception would certainly cover physical observation, seeing what's on the page, and then analysis would be a deeper operation, understanding what's going on in the text, how different parts of the text relate to each other. Someone else saying perceiving and analyzing. Yes, both of those. Okay, and same question. What are you doing when you're listening? Is it exactly the same as reading? Obviously not. So this is beginning to get to the question of the differences between the two operations. So what's happening when you're listening? Giving you some thinking time. a receiving approach. So yes, I suppose the listener is in a much more receptive state than the reader, because the reader can control the process, decide what to focus on, can go back to check things that came before in the text, whereas the listener is really at the mercy of what they're hearing, and the processing goes on in real time. You can't go back unless you ask the other person to repeat. Visualizing, imagining, yes. There's a very nice joke about the pleasure of listening to drama, theatre plays on radio. And the joke is that the pictures are better because you're using your imagination. Concentrating, yes. When you listen, you have to listen hard. Think of the collocations, think of the adverbs that often go together with listening. Listen carefully, listen closely. Concentrating, yes, you really have to concentrate when you're listening, because, as I say, it's happening in real time, and you have to focus, you have to concentrate to grasp what you're hearing. Okay, good. Thank you for those thoughts. I'll leave the chat box on my screen so I can keep an eye on your messages. So thinking about reading and listening in the real world and in the classroom. Let's start with the real world. Can you think about everything you've read in Uzbek, maybe in Russian, in English, maybe in French or German? I don't know which languages you read in, but think about everything you've read. And I don't just mean textbooks, but everything, all the text that you've read in the last 24 hours. And just jot down in the chat box a few examples. It won't be an exhaustive list, but let's get an idea of the range of things that everybody reads on a daily basis. What have you read over the last 24 hours? Curriculum, gosh. I don't know if that means the national curriculum or your school curriculum, program, lesson plans, yes. Any reading for pleasure? Reading a book called Wonder with my students, that sounds good. Advertisements, textbooks. Yes, there are some things like advertisements that we don't decide to read, but they pop up and we're kind of forced to read them. Books about teaching methodology. Okay, I'm sure most people would, if we took some time to do a group survey, we would come up with a very long list. Advertisements, menus, the TKT course, yes. Tasks from an online platform, TKT preparation materials. Okay, well, it's good to know that you're all reading the TKT book. But we do read, I say we, I mean people in general, read a tremendous variety of texts every day of our lives. If you really sort of replay the recording of your life over the past 24 hours, I'm sure you would come up with a very long list of different things that you've read. Timetables, menus, newspapers, books, curriculum documents, etc., etc. Okay. Now, think about the same question with listening. Everything that you've listened to in the past 24 hours. Podcasts, yes. Very popular now. Songs, broken news. I'm not sure what the broken means. Perhaps it's bad news, or I don't know. Songs in the classroom. Good morning, America. Okay, so radio, podcasts, news, idioms. Right, and as with reading, we listen to a great variety of things. Nobody's mentioned listening to other people in real life. Okay, radio, TV, songs, and of course we listen to each other. We listen to our students. We listen to our colleagues. Songs we listen only for educational purposes. Don't get me wrong. Not quite sure what that means. Does that mean you don't listen to songs for pleasure? I don't know. Some people, I guess, don't. Okay. Right. So a great variety of reading materials, a great variety of listening materials in our daily lives. Now, what about the classroom? How many of the text types are of the text types that you've mentioned, songs, podcasts, stories, all the other things that you've mentioned, radio programs, TV programs, films, how many of those text types are represented in your textbooks or used in your classrooms? How much of the variety of real life listening and real life reading actually are students actually exposed to in the classroom? A lot, some, a little. Nearly all of them. That's very good. Not so much authentic text. So there might be a range of text types, but in many cases, specially written for the classroom, I guess, or specially recorded. And that's really the point that I'm getting at here, obviously, that the way that we select texts, or the way texts are selected for us for reading and listening in the classroom, often doesn't reflect the range and variety of the reading and listening that our students will have to do in the future in real life. It's about 80% of the virtual text. As our textbooks are not authentic, we address other authentic sources. Right, I think teachers very often go outside the textbook to enliven their classes and to bring a bit more of the real world into the classroom. Okay. So let's think about teaching versus testing. I'd like you to think of a reading lesson or a listening lesson that you can recall. It may be a lesson that you taught in one of your classes. It may be a colleague's lesson that you were able to observe. But just think of a lesson that was focusing on reading or on listening that you can remember quite well. Okay. Now, in your mind, you can make notes if you like, but I'm not going to collect your notes. But in your mind, just think back through the lesson and reconstruct the stages of the lesson. How did the lesson develop? What were the main stages? You don't have to write anything in the chat box yet. How did the lesson begin? How did it develop? What kind of tasks did you give or did your colleague give to the students? And how did the lesson continue? How did it end? Somebody's saying pre, while, and post. So activities before the text, during the process of reading or listening, and some kind of follow-up activity. Now, think about what the learners had to do. What kind of tasks were they given? And then ask yourself, and this is the question I've been building up to, were they developing reading or listening skills, or were they being tested on their comprehension? Be honest. So we're getting some answers here. The learners had to read, to follow the text, I guess that means, analyze and discuss. A warm-up procedure, a conclusion. So thinking about the lesson that you've brought to mind, would you say that the lesson contained activities to develop the students' capacity for reading and listening, reading or listening, or were the tasks more concerned with checking their comprehension? Ekaterina is referring to these 3 steps, and I guess she's referring back to Rustam's 3 keywords: warm-up, procedure, conclusion. And Ekaterina is saying they develop their skills if you follow these 3 steps. Comprehension is the core of acquiring knowledge. Therefore, I constantly include comprehension questions. Fair enough, absolutely. I'm not saying that comprehension questions are bad, but simply that it's very easy, and I plead guilty to this when I first started teaching. I'm sure I did it myself very often. It's very easy for a reading or listening lesson just to become a comprehension checking lesson. I think checking comprehension should clearly be part of what's happening. As a teacher, you want to be sure, you want to make sure that the students are understanding, have understood the text, because without that understanding, you can't do anything else. But students would not progress very far. They would not develop those skills if the lesson consisted only of comprehension checking. And I think that's a pitfall. It's something to be aware of and to watch out for. That when we talk about reading lessons, listening lessons, we're often doing more testing than teaching. That's the point. Okay, let's think about some of the differences then between listening and reading. Let's ask you to do some of the work. I have got a list, got quite a detailed list, but I'd like to get some ideas from you. So differences between spoken language and written language. What comes to mind immediately? I've mentioned one or two of them in our introduction this morning. When we talked, do you remember when we talked about the different kinds of mental processing? Register, formal and informal. Yes. Writing tends to be more formal. Speaking tends to be less formal. Though, of course, you can have informal writing and you can have formal speaking. But generally, written language tends to be more formal, spoken language less formal. Pronunciation and spelling, that's an interesting pair because they're both concerned with form. And when you're speaking, it's pronunciation that makes the content clear. When you're writing, spelling does the same job. Productive versus receptive. Well, I would say that they are both productive skills. If you're thinking about speaking and writing, but that's going to be Chris's topic next week. Yeah, they are productive. But I'm thinking more about the differences between language when it's spoken and language when it's written. Remember, we're focusing on receptive skills this week. Okay, let me give you a few of my, well, quite a lot of my ideas and see if they resonate with you. So this is the point that we've mentioned, and notice the use of tends. It's a tendency. It's not an absolute rule, but the majority of written language tends to be more formal. And conversely, the majority of spoken language tends to be more informal. Speaking happens in real time, unless it's a recording and you can rewind, you can't go back. Speaking just flows forwards. Whereas if we're thinking about reading, you can refer to it, you can reread, you can refer back. Speaking is usually spontaneous, off the cuff, not planned, whereas writing is usually planned and carefully crafted, carefully put together. When you write something, you want to make sure, you want to be as sure as you can that the person on the receiving end is going to understand what you've written, because they are not, you are not usually present when they read what you've written. So you want to make sure that there's no ambiguity. In the chat box, there's a reminder that spoken language is often very informal, using contractions, using slang. And yes, I would say that spoken language is messy. It's untidy. It's full of hesitation, repetition, reformulation, interruptions. I'm trying to be as clear and coherent as I can as I speak to you in these weekly meetings. but I'm sure if I played back the recordings, I would be quite embarrassed at the amount of hesitation, unfinished sentences, sentences that I get halfway through and then change my mind and reformulate. And that's the nature of spoken language. Whereas written language is usually highly precise and structured, and it has to be extremely explicit. You have to make sure that you're saying exactly what you want to say, what you need to say, because you're not going to be there to clarify any uncertainties. It may be difficult to decode connected speech because sounds, remember in last week's session on phonology, we looked at the ways in which sounds in separate words are joined together, or sometimes disappear, or are linked together when there's a stream of connected speech. And those are, I would say, issues of aural perception. We had the word perception at the beginning of this session. That can make listening very challenging. And I don't know about your students, but my students, when I ask them, tend to say that they find listening is the most difficult of the skills for them for those reasons. Rustam is saying spoken and written language are considered as subjective. Not quite sure what that means, but I suppose that the speaker or the writer is expressing their thoughts, their ideas, their opinions, and in that sense they are subjective. And it's very often also a matter of personal style. People have their own ways of speaking and writing. So we're not dealing with a single consistent code. We have to be ready for aspects of personal style. The way that an individual speaks may not be the way that the voices in the recordings that we use in the classroom in listening lessons speak, and likewise the way that a particular writer writes may not resemble very closely the standard forms of well-ordered writing that we might see in the textbook. So whereas words in a stream of speech may be difficult to separate, difficult to understand when we hear them run together, the words on the page have equal weight. It's much easier to deal with words on the page as a reader than it is to deal with a stream of speech as a listener. We can add to our meaning through body language. Gesture, facial expression can help the listener to interpret what they hear. And this brings me to one of the things that I really believe very strongly, and that happens too rarely in the classroom, and that is that listening practice should, where possible, as far as possible, be done with video recordings rather than purely audio recordings. If you think about it, there are relatively few occasions in real life when we have to listen without seeing the person. You can see me now, I think, in a little box in the top corner of your screen. And sometimes I'm doing this, I'm making gestures to emphasize what I'm saying. You can see my my facial expressions, and it helps you to follow what I'm saying. in the classroom, if we deprive learners of that visual accompaniment, and we put them in a position where they just have to listen with their eyes closed, as it were, it's only really if they're listening to podcasts or radio programs, or if they're on the telephone, that they're in that situation. If you think of all the other situations in life, when we listen, we usually see the person or people speaking. So body language can be a very important part of understanding spoken language. Written language has the disadvantage of very often providing no visual support. And very young children have a much more supportive reading experience with picture books. But as we get older, the pictures disappear and there's only text on the page. In spoken language, stress and intonation, pausing, emphasis may help to get your meaning across. Sometimes in writing, the visual appearance of the text on the page can do the same thing. If you think about things like underlining or using bold or italics or bullet points, that's a sort of written equivalent of stress and intonation. In your first piece of homework for me, it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, if you remember, there was a question about the importance of stress and intonation. And a number of you said, oh, they're not as important as using the language. Well, as I said last week, I think they are as important, if not more important, sometimes for getting meaning across. So that's certainly an important aspect of listening that we should be training listeners to take account of when they're listening. With spoken language, you usually get immediate feedback. There's an interplay between the speaker and the listener, obviously not if we're talking about podcasts or radio. Whereas written language, there's usually delayed feedback. You have to wait for a reply to your email or the teacher's comments on your homework or whatever it is. So there's a difference in the relationship between speaker and listener on the one hand and writer and reader on the other. And this has an influence on the use of language. Spoken language can be much less explicit because you have the opportunity to clarify, to ask for and to receive clarification. Whereas with writing, you have to make sure that your message is 100% understandable if you can. As one of you mentioned in the in the chat box, speaking is full of contractions and slang and false starts. You start saying something, you change your mind, you restart. Fillers. If you listen to the recording of this webinar, you'll hear me saying and quite a lot, I'm afraid, because that's what we do. You might have different sounds in different ways of doing it in Uzbek. You might not say you might have another sound, but it's a characteristic of spoken language in any language. Pausing as well can be an important feature while the speaker is searching for the right word. pausing in order to emphasize the next thing they're going to say, and so on. Whereas written text is very carefully checked, proofread, corrected. Okay, so reading and listening. Let's pin this down a bit more. Let's be a bit more precise. We talk about the reading skill or the listening skill, but in fact, we should talk about reading skills and listening skills in the plural. So what are the sub-skills that go together, excuse me, that combine to make up the skill of reading? Can we have a few contributions in the chat box, please? What do you immediately think of when you think of reading sub-skills? Skimming and scanning, reading for detail, reading for gist. Absolutely, those are the ones that come to mind first. So skimming for gist, scanning for details, understanding text, understanding structure at sentence level, but also at text level. I would say extensive reading is a type of reading rather than a skill in itself, though it involves a lot of skills, a lot of sub-skills: predicting, deducing, inferring. Okay, some good ideas there, certainly. Going back to one of the first words in the chat box this morning, perception. And so visual perception, I would mention first, understanding the visual appearance of text, understanding the layout of the text, the visual organization of the text on the page, use of headings, captions, and so on, recognizing the script, recognizing words, inferring, I think somebody used that, yes, somebody mentioned that in the chat box, inferring the meaning of unfamiliar items. I should have highlighted that or put a star instead of a bullet point, because I think it's a key reading skill. I'm trying to read a book in French at the moment, and I'm trying to stop myself from clicking on the dictionary every 5 minutes and make myself do the work of using all the language that I do recognize and I do know to help me infer the meaning of the items that I don't recognize or don't know. And it is a discipline, but it's a key reading skill. You mentioned structure. So understanding the structural relations between parts of a sentence and parts of a text. Identifying the topic. I lived in Italy for a short time years ago, and I used to read the newspaper every day. And I discovered that a feature of Italian journalism, and perhaps of Italian writing in general, was that they didn't put the topic sentence in the first paragraph as I expected, and I had to skim 2 or 3 paragraphs before I got to the topic. So identifying the topic is certainly an important reading skill. Skimming for gist, distinguishing the main ideas from supporting details, ignoring information that is not important, that is redundant. So sometimes it's as important to know what not to read or what not to focus on as it is to understand the things that are important. Following a sequence, following instructions, following an argument, following the unfolding of a story. Somebody's saying you're a high context culture like Italians. That's interesting. Okay. Understanding subtext. So understanding the underlying attitude of the writer, or information that may not be explicitly stated, but is implied. Recognizing the writer's reason for writing, or the speaker's reason for speaking. Sorry, we're talking about reading, aren't we? So recognizing the writer's purpose or attitude. Recognizing discourse markers, those conjunctions and introductory phrases that act as signposts and show you the direction of the text. So things like, however, in conclusion, another point is. Recognizing the function of sentences, even when they're not introduced by a clearly marked word or phrase. Scanning for details, selecting specific information, training students not to be concerned about understanding every word, but to read selectively, to get the information that they need from the text, and to have the confidence and the discrimination to separate what they want, what they need from the text, and what is not important. So selecting and extracting, and perhaps transcoding, changing to a different, transferring information from a prose text into a diagram or a table. Adapting your reading speed according to purpose. So we don't read everything in the same way, at the same rate, with the same degree of detailed attention. Depends on the nature of the text, and it depends on our reason for reading. Using what we know about life, about the real world, to make predictions about the text or to interpret the text. So that's quite an extensive list of reading sub-skills. And I'm not surprised that when we started this on this slide, the first contributions that we got in the chat box were skimming, scanning, reading for gist, reading for detail, because those are the ones that I think everybody is very aware of. But if you dig a little deeper, you find that reading is actually a very, very complex operation that includes all of these varied and often quite challenging sub-skills. So a little practice. You're going to read a review of a book. It comes from the British Council Learn English Teens website. The book is called Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls, which is a great title. And you're going to find out this very little mini review what it's about. And I'd like you to imagine that you're a teacher who's chosen this text for your class. And think about these questions. First, how could you provide a context for students to read the text? Secondly, what reading skills and strategies would you aim to develop? How could students be motivated to read the text? What kinds of top-down and bottom-up processing would help learners to understand the text? So how could students be motivated to read? How could you provide a context? What skills and strategies would you aim to develop? and what kinds of top-down and bottom-up processing would help learners to understand? And what follow-up task or tasks could you give? This is the cover of the book, and this is the review. Okay, we've got a little time in hand. I'm assuming that since we started about 10 minutes late, we can we have another 10 minutes or so. If that's okay, please let me know if it's not. And I think what I'll do, because it's quite it's a task that requires a little thinking, I will send it to you as a homework task, okay? So that you have a good chance to think about it and to respond to it. And we've looked at reading sub-skills. Same question. What about listening sub-skills? What are they? Perhaps a more difficult one to answer. Let me give you some ideas. Thinking first about perception, the need to recognize individual sounds. And we talked about that in our phonology session last week. The importance very often of discriminating between sounds. Remember ship and sheep. Something we've mentioned already this morning, the challenge of identifying reduced forms in fast connected speech. So elision, when sounds are omitted, think about handbag. Assimilation, when sounds are merged together. Catenation, linking the end of one consonant sound at the end of one word with a vowel sound at the beginning of the next. And as you've mentioned, contractions. Identifying word stress and sentence stress. And recognizing intonation when it's meaningful. Very important in English. Stress and intonation. As with reading, we talked about word recognition. With listening, there's also the skill of identifying individual words. Samsakova is suggesting listening for gist and listening intensively. Yes, I think we can transfer that idea of gist and detail from reading to listening. The skill of building up meaning as you listen. So as you listen, the same thing happens with reading, but with listening, it's more challenging because it's unfolding in real time. You are constantly using what you've heard to predict what you're going to hear. And you're constantly hypothesizing, making a hypothesis, making a good guess, an intelligent guess about what you're going to hear next. So we tend to think about prediction as something that the teacher does, or teacher gets the students to do before they read or before they listen. But in fact, prediction is a constant process throughout your reading, throughout your listening. You're constantly thinking what's coming next. You're anticipating, what am I going to hear now? What am I going to read next? Think of that moment when you turn the page of a book and the text on the first page ends in the middle of a sentence. In your head, without thinking about it consciously, you're anticipating how the sentence is going to conclude when you turn the page. So we are constantly predicting. Identifying discourse markers, which are much less formal in speech, but perform the same sort of function. Then, as I was saying, as a matter of fact, to start with, understanding gist, identifying main points, discriminating between main points and subsidiary points, understanding details. So a lot of commonality with reading, but some key differences. And again, inferring what the speaker doesn't actually say. At the moment, we're very interested to see what's going to happen to our Prime Minister. And we listen very carefully to what he says, but we also think about what he's not saying. Using what you know about a topic to predict what you're going to hear. And you mentioned pre, while, and post activities, and warming or warm-up activities. And I think that's often the way to get students to focus is with a lead-in, a warm-up activity, which gets them thinking about the subject so that the language that's associated with the subject comes to their minds and they begin to predict what the kind of information and also the kind of language that they think they're going to hear. Using knowledge of predictable interaction patterns. So when we listen to conversation, we have certain expectations about the ways in which people interact. Connecting words to non-linguistic features, recognizing the speaker's intentions, identifying the speaker's mood or attitude, recognizing conversational signals. So recognizing when a speaker wants to intervene or announces a change of topic, predicting the speaker's next move. These are all listening sub-skills. So as with reading, there's a lot more going on than simply or than only understanding the meaning of the words. And I referred in the homework task to top-down and bottom-up processing. We're going to listen to a short clip from Professor Jack Richards on listening comprehension, in which he explains top-down and bottom-up processing, which I don't know if you're familiar with those terms or if you wondered what I was referring to, but he explains them very, very clearly.
Hello. Today I'd like to talk about listening comprehension, something that you're doing right now. How does comprehension work? It's a very complex process, but researchers have identified two different strands, you might say, of listening that are important to think about. One is called bottom-up processing and the other is called top-down processing. Bottom-up processing is the traditional view of comprehension. It says when we try to understand something, either something in print or something we're listening to, we have to work through language. We work at the level of the word and the sentence, and then we extract the meaning from it. So we start from the bottom, which is the actual language we hear, and we analyze it if you like mentally, and then we arrive at the top, which is the meaning. For that reason, it's called bottom-up processing. Bottom-up processing suggests that the meaning is contained in the words that we hear or see. The meaning and the message are all contained in the language that we hear. However, there's another form of processing that's involved when we engage in comprehension, and that's called top-down processing. And top-down processing suggests that we start from meaning and then work towards language. What does that mean? Well, it means that we bring to comprehension background knowledge, ideas, information, expectations, and we use this as we listen, and that enables us to, if you like, bypass some of the bottom-up processing we might normally be engaged in. For example, supposing I tell you I'm going to tell you something about an earthquake. Immediately you activate knowledge that you have about this topic. Where did it happen? How many people were injured? What is being done about it? And so on. That generates a set of questions that you will use to process the information I give you about the earthquake. This is an example of top-down processing. It's using background knowledge as a basis for mapping what we know against what we hear and arriving at a meaning of the message. So the two go side by side, if you like, bottom up and top down. The more we know about a topic, the more background knowledge we're able to access, the more top-down processing we're able to make use of. The less we know about a topic, the more language-based processing we will have to make use of. So when we're teaching students to read or to listen, we often have to look at a text and ask, will the students be able to process this using background knowledge, or will they have to be given some help in accessing this text, some pre-listening, some pre-reading activities that will activate the knowledge and information that may be relevant to understanding that topic. A related concept is the concept of schema. A schema refers to the body of knowledge that you bring to bear on a particular topic or a situation. For example, if I mention a supermarket, you think of a physical context, you think of people there for a particular purpose, doing things using procedures and artifacts and so on to achieve their goals. This is all part of the schema, if you like, of the supermarket. Again, I mentioned the earthquake and the information you bring to bear on that particular topic. So in real-world comprehension, we access hundreds of schemas of this kind, which enable us to process language simply and effectively. And it's because we're making use of these schemas that speakers don't need to spell out everything that they could say about a topic, because they assume that the listener will be accessing that topic and filling out the details herself or himself. So comprehension then is a process that draws on both language-based processing as well as meaning-based processing. Bottom-up and top-down, they go hand in hand. And when we're teaching comprehension, we need to be sure that we're not just teaching bottom-up processing, language-based processing. We're not just working at the level of words and sentences. We're also activating background knowledge and encouraging students to make predictions, to guess what's coming, to draw on their knowledge of the world, to enable them to listen the way people do in authentic listening situations.
Okay, that brings the session to a very nice end. Jack Richards has put across those concepts of bottom-up and top-down processing, or processing as he pronounces it, because he's Australian, probably much more clearly and coherently than I would have done. So thank you, Professor Richards. And it's a nice point at which to finish. I will send you a copy of the review of the book. I will also send you a link to a short listening passage, a dialogue between a mother and son about study habits. You can choose, the questions are the same about how you would use the texts, and you can choose either to answer the questions about the reading text or the listening or if you like, you can do both. So I'll send you that as this week's task. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your contributions in the chat box. Just let me see what's there. Why am I relating these processes to inductive and deductive approaches? That seems like a rhetorical question, somebody asking themselves the question. I'm not sure that they do relate to, I suppose, yeah. No, I I think it's rather confusing to try to relate top-down and bottom-up processing to inductive and deductive approaches. Inductive and deductive approaches are really related to teaching, presenting, and teaching new language, new grammatical structures. I don't think that's a very helpful comparison. I'll have to give that some thought, but I think it's more confusing than enlightening. Okay, I won't keep you any longer. As I say, Chris will be with you next week, and he'll be looking at productive skills, speaking and writing. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of echoes of what we've said about spoken and written language this week, but he'll be looking at the output side rather than the language input. I hope you found the session useful, and I hope that more of you will find time to do the homework task. Please, in preparation for next week's session, I'm sure you'll do this anyway, but please check unit 6 and 8 of the book on on writing and speaking in preparation for Chris's session. And don't forget, I'll be very happy to hear from you with last week's homework as well as this week's. Okay, thank you all very much, and I look forward to seeing you again or speaking to you again in 2 weeks' time. Thank you. So thank you very much. And when you see IATEFL webinars next time, you'll know it's me. Sorry about that.